Go ahead and dig in.
All right, well, I'll get us started for our presentation today, and I'd like to just say thank you to everyone that's taking time out of your day to meet with us this afternoon. We are here to present the results of our most recent audit for the city of Snoqualmie. I'll talk a little bit about the scope of our audit, but before I do, I'd like to introduce my partners that are here with me today. So, that would be helpful. Testing, does that work?
Yeah, there's a switch on it at the,
Jimmy can assist you if you need.
behind you, yeah. There you go.
Okay, that sounds better.
Perfect.
Okay, we'll go ahead and restart just in one moment. So my name is Christina Baylor, and I serve as the audit manager for one of our local offices within the Office of the Washington State Auditor. It's been a pleasure to return out here to the city today to present the results of our most recent audit, and I've had the pleasure to work with the city over the last couple of audits, so it's great to see everyone again today. As I mentioned, I'd like to introduce my staff that are with me so that you have some names to faces, and then we'll begin our presentation. With me today, we have Clay Trushinsky. I did the same thing at the entrance conference. Clay is serving as an assistant audit manager for our office. He was involved in the review and supervision of the city's audit, so you may have seen his face while the audit was underway. And then also with me today is Stacy Chen. She is returning this year as the audit lead. She formerly led the city's most recent audit, so she brought all that knowledge back with her this year and was able to complete the audit again, which is really great. And then also with us today is Mark Raposo, and Mark serves as one of our assistant director of local audits. He oversees roughly 8 teams across our state agency and has a great wealth of knowledge, and he's here to answer any questions that the city might have. So for our presentation for you today, we've prepared a packet of information. Everybody should have that in front of you, and we'll be walking through that during the course of our conversation. Please note that that information in your packet is draft. It is not considered final until it's published on our website. And so we will be answering any questions from the city personnel at the end of our meeting today. And if you have any questions, we'll make sure those are resolved prior to issuing the city's reports. So if you'll walk with me, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll open up the packet and we'll see that it is organized in 2 parts. You'll see on the left-hand side of the city's packet is what we call our exit conference agenda. This is an overview of everything we plan to discuss today, and we'll come back to it in a few moments. We're going to open from this document and then go through the reports and come back to this one in our closing remarks. But on the right-hand side, we have our draft audit reports, and these are the documents that will be eventually published on the website and available for public review. So starting from our exit conference agenda, I want to speak a little bit about the scope of the audit that we're here to share the results with you, and also talk a little bit about reporting levels for any recommendations that are resulting from our audit. So under the heading Audit Reports, you'll see that we're actually issuing 2 separate audit reports, and that has to do with the 2 separate audits that we performed. The first is what's called an accountability audit. For accountability audits, what we're looking at is cities' compliance with state laws, regulations, contracts, agreements, your own policies and procedures, and then more importantly, we're also looking at general safeguarding of public resources. Are the city's controls adequate to identify any discrepancies or prevent misappropriation from occurring? And then for our second audit, we performed a financial statement audit, and that objective of that audit, if you will, is to take a look at the city's financial statements that you prepare annually and make sure that those statements are prepared correctly, that they're free from material error, and eventually at the end of that audit we issue what's called an opinion as to whether those statements are free from material misstatement and correct. And opinions are really important for external users because that's what lets them know that they can place reliance on the financial statements that you prepare. So the scope of the 2 audits differs a little bit. So please note that our accountability audit scope covers a 2-year period. It covers January 1st, 2017 through December 31st, 2018. And that was in response to the timing of the last audit. We did a one-time review of the city's accountability audit for a 2-year period when the city is typically an annual audit for that. And then the financial statement audit has remained on a one-year cycle, and so again, the scope of this audit was for the 2018 calendar year only. So a little bit about recommendations that may result from the audit work that's performed. Our office has 3 primary levels of audit recommendations. The highest level of an audit recommendation is called an audit finding. We are really pleased to report that there were no audit findings issued during the course of either audit that we conducted. An audit finding is our most significant level of reporting. If we had a finding, it would be included in the audit reports, and the city would have the opportunity to respond to the finding. As I mentioned, there were no audit findings issued during the course of our audit. The next level down is something called a management letter. So management letters are significant items that are not at the level of an audit finding, but we still want to bring them to the attention of the city council and the mayor in a formal letter. So therefore, we report them in what's called a management letter form. They're not included in our audit report. There is a brief reference to those items, and we do have a few items reported at the management letter level during the course of this audit. We'll walk you through those items, but again, those are not included in the reports and won't be published on our website. And then our lowest level of recommendation that is very frequently issued during the course of our audits, that is called an exit item. Exit items are likened to housekeeping items. They're very common for auditors to find during the course of the audit. They're very minor items that are just opportunities for the city to strengthen your controls, but don't represent significant issues where internal controls are broken or need to rise to the level of the governing body. They're typically addressed at the level of management. So with that, we're going to take a break from the agenda and we're going to go through the audit reports. But before we do, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Stacy. She has a few highlights that she'd like to share with you today before going through the reports.
Thank you, Christina. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the city's staff for their cooperation and timely response to all our requests throughout the audits. Specifically, we would like to thank Jerry, our audit liaison, who we work very closely with throughout the audit. Our audit require a lot of coordination of meetings with different departments and also extensive amounts of documents that we need for our review. All of these were coordinated through Jerry, so we really appreciate him for doing that. At this point, we do have audit reports that we want to present to you. The first report we will be presenting is the accountability audit reports, which in your packet. I will walk you through this audit reports. During this process, if you have any question, please don't hesitate to let us know. The audit report starts on page 2, which is report on accountability. Following by that is the table of contents of this audit reports. The actual results is on page 4. This page summarizes the overall results and conclusion of the areas that we have examined. As Christina mentioned earlier, accountability audit, we review for compliance with state laws, regulation, and your own policies, and we review to ensure that the city have adequate controls over safeguarding our public resources. For this audit, we did not review every transaction or activities of the city, but we do examine areas that represent highest risk of fraud, loss, or non-compliance. Based on our risk assessment and audit planning procedures that we have performed during the beginning of our audit, we have selected some of the areas that we want to focus on during the audit. And in those areas that we have examined during the audit, our conclusion is that we determined the city's operation comply in all material respects with applicable state laws, regulation, and your own policy, and the city have provided adequate controls for safeguarding of public resources. So this result is summarized in the first paragraph of this page. The second paragraph reference to the management letter, which we have provided to you in your packet as well. The management letter communicates certain matters relating to general disbursement, contracts and agreements, and cash receipting that we have reviewed, which we will go over in a few more minutes. Okay. Briefly, I will go over the areas that we have examined during our audits. We have selected 5 areas that we looked at, and the first area we looked at is accounts payable. We reviewed the city's policies and procedures for general disbursement. We specifically look at credit cards, travel expenditures, electronic fund transfers, employee reimbursement, as well as voided vouchers and customer and vendor refunds as well. We had an opportunity to meet with the city departments to obtain a overall or full understanding of the approval process of disbursement, and we test some of these disbursement to ensure that they represent valid and allowable expenses, and also to determine if they are properly approved in accordance with the city's municipal code and state law. The second area down we review is a review of sale transaction of city property. We review for compliance with city policies, and we tested those payments that received from the buyer in accordance with the agreements to ensure that they are in compliance in those terms. Third area we review was for bid law compliance for a public works project. In addition to this review, we also review 4 contracts and agreements for compliance with contract terms. For area small and attractive assets, we review theft-sensitive items to ensure that they are properly monitored and tracked with accurate information. Last area is cash receipting. We review for timeliness and completeness of deposits and adjustments. Is any questions?
Question, what is an attractive asset?
These are theft-sensitive items. We consider those are above 500 and less than the capital assets threshold, which is, I believe it's 5,000. Yeah.
So they're typically items that are under your capitalization threshold that could be theft sensitive. So it really is up to the city to determine what those items may be. We wouldn't expect that you track all tables and pencils and things of that nature, but certain items, certain electronics, certain items in the police department especially could be theft sensitive. And so we typically look for the city to determine, do you have a policy over that area to define what items are small and attractive, and do you have procedures to monitor those items to make sure that they don't walk away and go missing?
So you're aware that we don't have a capitalization threshold because we're a cash basis entity. So that answer wasn't very useful to us.
So cash basis cities can still have a $5,000 or a different number for capitalization threshold, even though you're not presenting capital assets on your financials. You can still have that determined. So it's not a reference to what's on your financials, but it's really just a threshold for what you consider to be larger items versus small and attractive items.
Any other questions?
And I would just like to add before we move on, we do have an area in our organization called the Center for Government Innovation. They publish a lot of great resources and are constantly coming out with new resources, but in particular, they do have a resource on monitoring and tracking small and attractive items. We've included that at the back of your packet for your reference. It's a really great tool if you're interested in learning how the city could potentially improve its process over that area.
So the next page in the audit report is related reports. In this case, we do have a report issue for the financial statement audits, which we include a link where you can find that. The next page is information about the city. We do want to keep this information as accurate as possible. So if you do see anything that needs to be updated, please let us know. Below that is the audit history, where you can find the past and the current audit reports that our office issued to the city. The last page of this audit report is information about our office. Is there any questions about the audit report that we just went over before we go into the management letter that we have for you today? No? Okay. So attached to the audit report is the management letter. The first page is the cover letter for the management letter. The actual management letter is in page 2. So as I mentioned earlier, our letter addresses 3 areas that we reviewed. First one is general disbursement, and then we have contracts and agreement and cash receipting. So we will start with general disbursement. We have tested 11 millions of disbursement, which represent approximately 10% of the total 2017 and 18 payments that the city made. And we have reviewed the internal controls over monitoring those expenditures and tested those disbursements to ensure that they are properly supported and then approved in accordance with the city's municipal code and state law. We have identified several areas where there are weaknesses in the internal control. For instances, we noted there are the ACH payment for utility taxes that made in 2017 and 18 were not properly reviewed or approved in accordance with the city's municipal code. And we also know that some of the tested payment were made for refunding customer and developer relating to rentals and development projects. And some of those tested payments that we noted, supporting documentation, some of the payments that we tested were not properly supported with the original records to support. And further of the tested payments, we found one rental deposit in the amount of $500 were refunded twice. We also reviewed voided vouchers. During our audit, we found 3 voided vouchers where a stop payment were not requested from the bank. Overall, we also looked at policies for general disbursement. We specifically found that a policy specifically related to credit card purchases, travel-related disbursement, voided vouchers were outdated. During our audit, we acknowledged that the city is undergoing a review of policies and procedure and have taken actions, but we do still want to recommend the city to continue to review the policies and to ensure that it provide adequate guidance for the areas that we review or general disbursement in this case. We recommend the city to ensure that all ACH payments are properly approved in accordance with your municipal code and as well as the state law. Also keep records in accordance with the state records retention schedule, as well as ensuring a stop payment is requested from the bank. At last, for this one, we recommend the city to ensure that all disbursements are properly supported with adequate supporting documentation. Is there any questions? So the second section of this
Trying to understand what this concept, so I'm trying to understand what we as a council maybe ought to do as we read these items. And I have a couple questions here, but one thing I'm completely baffled by is this notion that a policy is out of date. What would be the professional standard? What is the standard that tells us something has to not be out of date, and what defines being out of date? Because honestly, I've never heard of this concept before. So maybe you could elaborate on this concept.
So in terms of a policy being out of date, that is referencing that the procedure that's actually employed at the city is differing from the policy that's on the books, if you will. So, from the information we received through our test, there were differences, and we were bringing those to your attention. But we were also made aware that some policies have not been revisited in a number of years, and so that the city has actively let us know that they are working on that and making sure that those are shored up with their current practices, and that would be something brought before council.
So the procedure, in cases where the procedure that they're following is not the same as the procedure in their policy or policy and procedures documentation. Is the procedure that they're following adequate? So is this a documentation problem, or is it something more than a documentation problem? Are their procedures inadequate?
Stacy, I don't know if you have any examples to add to this, but from my understanding and review of the work, we are not questioning the procedures that are being employed. The city has the authority to decide what policies and procedures it wants to govern its operations. We just noted that there was a difference in the stated policy from what is actually occurring. But we are not questioning the authority of the procedure that's being performed.
Okay.
That did seem adequate.
Thank you. So let me ask, on these, you meant, I'm just kind of looking at these bullets. I seem to be taking them in the wrong order. I'm sorry. There's discussion of 3 lost checks for which there was not a stop payment requested. Was there a loss? Were these? I'm trying to understand why that's a problem other than some technicality. Was there a loss or?
It was checks that sent to vendors, and it was requested by the vendor that they didn't get it through the mail, so it was treated as lost checks in the mail. So it's being voided in the system. So they called it the lost checks, but there's no loss to it.
But no actual loss, cash loss to the city.
Okay, so the $11,489 wasn't a loss to the city. It's just that's the dollar amount of these 3 checks combined.
That is correct, yeah.
So so I'm just trying to understand how to follow up with staff. Is there a state law that, like, are they required by law to void those checks? Is there a compliance issue with state law, or is this just sort of a practice that in your view would be a good idea to void checks, but if they chose not, if they had a policy not to, you'd accept that, or kind of what's your take on this?
I'm personally not aware of a state law.
There's no state law on that, but it would be a prudent business practice to do some kind of stop loss on those, because if you have a check or warrant that's out there that is claimed to be lost and it's subsequently cashed, and you reissued another check for the same amount and that's cashed, now you have a loss.
Right, but you say it's a prudent business practice, but I can show you many businesses that do not have a policy of incurring the cost of voiding checks.
And that'd be fine too, but it's a risk that the city is going to take on. That in this case, it doesn't sound like there's a loss, but certainly if one does happen, we're going to follow up and find out, well, how did it happen? So again, is it a best practice that the city should take on? That's entirely up to the city management to make that decision.
Good, that's what I was looking for. Is it kind of but you might expect that the city would have a policy as to when they do and don't.
Absolutely.
But you're not saying that they must issue stop payments. You're saying that's something you think they ought to look at and perhaps have a policy on.
That's correct. With internal controls, it's all reasonable assurances that these things are under control, not absolute. So, I mean, you could make it so finite that people can't do their jobs. So, again, it's up to city management to come up with a policy that says we're going to, up to a certain amount, issue a stop loss.
Great, thank you.
I'm no accountant, but I wanted to clarify on that one. I mean, in some of these cases, was it not a check that was not cashed by who it was sent to? And it's beyond the bank has a policy that cash isn't, if a check isn't cashed within 120 or whatever days, then it's voided automatically. So I think that was also what was the heart of it, and why some businesses don't have a policy, because if it goes beyond the bank has taken an action to effectively void it and doesn't require the city to void it. And was that not the case with some of these checks? Or?
These checks have a date. So then, we've been on fraud investigations where checks that are expired have been cashed by the bank.
Okay. Yeah.
So again, it's a risk that the city is going to take on if you choose to not void those checks. That's a risk that you're going to take on.
So there was an item that was, so here we are, the date today is March 3rd of 2020, and you're reporting to us on items for the period ending December 31st of 2018, which means we've gone an entire another year, an entire another audit cycle without us being made aware of these items, which means we are guaranteed repeat findings on every one of these items for 2019 because the city has not even known about these, right? So I'm kind of trying to deal with the fact that these items are so old and how to sort of respond. So the period under audit started over 3 years ago, January 1st of 2017.
Yeah, you're on looks like a 2-year audit cycle, so, the audit was conducted a little later than normal, but as far as any type of recurring audit findings or audit exceptions, we've duly noted them here and allow some opportunity to make those corrections, so we're not going to, ding you twice.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. So then, just back to this third item, the items, this one's sort of, I've got really scratching my head. So these refunds that were processed, are they now completely, are those deposits now completely refunded, or is this a process that's ongoing?
During the audit, we did not test every transaction or every deposit that the city have. We only selected a sample to test, so we did not know that if it's complete yet.
If I may comment, the city does.
Or Jerry, if you could come to a microphone, please. We just want to capture it on record.
The city does receive different types of deposits in the course of business and refunds those or retains them as appropriate when the landmark or benchmark events have taken place. Unfortunately, a number of years ago, there were some that should have been refunded and that didn't take place, and so we did a catch-up project mostly in 2018, and that catching up is done for the most part. There are just a few old deposits that we haven't been able to locate someone to issue a refund to, but in the main, it is done. But there are refunds made as a matter of routine business for more current events. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
It does. So is the state auditor satisfied that this finding relates to that catch-up process, or is this something that's an ongoing process? I'm trying to figure out how we should focus on it as a council.
Sure. So the main takeaway here is we are acknowledging that the city self-identified this issue, which was great. But what we wanted to bring to your attention was the original documentation for these deposits. It was let go after the initial period of records retention, which in most of these cases appeared to the city as around 6 years. But what we talked about with the city is really those records should be retained until the refunds are completely issued and not when, the specific project is done, because the refund is part of that process. So what we're bringing to your attention is just really looking at your process to retain that original documentation and making sure that that is retained until those final refunds are issued.
Councilor Mayo, I just want to clarify, you used the term "this finding" when you.
Excuse me, this comment, this management letter comment.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, that threw me. I did use the wrong word, thank you.
Usually riding us about using the wrong term. So
Well, it's very important.
So I enjoyed that.
These words, these words have important meanings, and there's a reason why the state auditor took the time they did to lay out what the different categories are and explain this. So, for these 6 years, I guess the reason I made that comment about the period that was being audited and the fact that some of your findings could refer to things that are 3 years ago. This finding refers to things that happened 20 years ago or more.
This management letter.
Did I do it again?
Yes, twice.
Not finding I will circle it and hopefully notice that. Yeah, so, and I'm sort of struck by the notion that I assume you've been looking at this year after year in your audits and never flagged this before. So I'm kind of wondering what changes to where in past years, you and therefore the staff, or not, maybe not therefore the staff, but you and also the staff thought that this practice was okay, and now you're saying, actually, no, it's not. I agree with you, by the way, on that there ought to be, so don't be mistaken. I agree with you, they ought to keep the support for this, but I'm trying to understand why this is now an issue for the state auditor when it was always okay with you for over 20 years.
And I don't know that we would make the statement that it's always been okay. As Stacy mentioned, our audits are performed using a risk-based audit approach, which means that we make a selection of areas to examine in any given audit period and don't provide absolute assurance on every practice the city is engaging in is done correctly. So I wouldn't be able to tell you right now if we have ever looked at this area at this particular level in the past. So this was something that was covered in our audit period during this review, and we were able to look at the practice. Again, we're highlighting that the city self-identified this issue, which is great, and this is just our remaining recommendation is to look at your documentation. But I wouldn't be able to sit here and say that we have signed off on this for the past 20 years because I have no recollection at this moment in time if or when we did last look at that item.
Is there something that changed about the risk then? It sounds like you just said using a risk-based audit approach, this year you looked at this, whereas in past years you didn't. So should we understand this to be a higher risk, or did you evaluate this as a higher risk than you have in the past?
Sure, so that's a great question. This area was actually brought to our attention through our Citizen Hotline referral program. So this was an area that came to us for consideration. If you look at it, the dollars, it is roughly small dollars. So it may not rise to the level of a planning procedure in any given year. But this was something that was picked up on through our Citizen Hotline referral. It was submitted for consideration. We were able to bring it into the audit plan and take a look at it this year, and that's where we came away with that recommendation.
Okay, so it would be reasonable for us to assume you haven't assessed this as having a risk that would cause you to look at it over these past 20 years. In fact, you didn't have a risk assessment that this was higher risk that caused you to look at it this year. You just looked at it because of the reason you just explained, and you found this one item of $500.
Well, the area was brought to our attention through the Citizen Hotline referral, but we do assess all risks that come out of planning and make a determination of which ones will be incorporated. So we did conclude that we were going to include that in our review based on comparison to all the other risks that were evaluated. So
I'm just trying to figure out if there's a higher risk that we should understand, because if there's now a higher risk in this area, that maybe we should understand that.
No, this was talking about our process, but the city does need to take a look at the recommendations coming out of the disbursement management letter in total and determine how that might impact your process. So again, we'll circle back to the takeaway here is just the document, the records retention, not that there was a particular problem with the refunds. We understand that there was a change in this city personnel that are overseeing this, and so the city staff has shown that they are making great effort to review this practice going forward. So.
Well, and that's what caused this to happen, right, is they reviewed it, and the city staff determined that they should resolve these outstanding deposits.
Correct.
Which it sounds like you concur.
We
that they
concur.
should have been doing that. Can I just, in the state of Washington, what happens to unclaimed funds at a city here? What, if we've got, do we turn those, do those get escheated to the state? Do we have an obligation to find the people as we did and pay back the money, or do we keep it? What is the law in Washington on that?
I'm not an attorney. My assistant attorney general always tells me that to remind me that I'm not an attorney. But in this state, all unclaimed property is remitted to the Department of Revenue under the Unclaimed Properties Act, and then it's stored there, and you can go online and look for any unclaimed property based upon your last name, and that's pretty much it. And I think in a certain time period, If the properties remain unclaimed, a portion of that gets returned, remitted to the city. I'm not sure about that piece, but anyway, it does escheat to the state.
So is it reasonable to have the point of view that these funds needed to be returned to the people they belong to? And either the city could have done that, or they could have turned it over to the state, and the state would have used the same documentation the city had, which is that documentation which currently exists, and just done the same thing, or at least perhaps done less affirmative effort and just perhaps put it on listings. But I'm trying to get at, is what they did not the correct thing? It sounds like what they did was the correct thing to do. It just highlighted that maybe we need to relook at kind of our documentation, what we retain related to deposits, as opposed to our
Yeah,
normal
I think that's
document
the thing
retention
that,
policy.
Christina was talking about earlier, that it's the conformance with the local government records retention schedule. You know, the transaction's not complete until the refund is, or the amount is refunded. So per the schedule, you should keep those documents until such time as the amount's refunded.
Okay, so it's an issue about retaining documentation. It's not an issue that these amounts, 59,704, 82,619, it's not an issue that those refunds were issued. You don't have any objection that occurred. You're saying, you're just recommending that documentation, that we relook at documentation. Is that
Well,
right?
If we did have an exception or an issue to it, it'd probably be in a finding or something worse, that if we felt that there was some sort of criminal activity going on. But in this case, it's in the letter to management for recommendations for improving internal controls in the city.
Great, so
Perspective.
as you pointed out, not a finding,
It is
a
not a
management letter
finding.
comment. Okay, thank you.
Just for our benefit, going forward, the documentation that the auditor's office would like us to have is original documentation, because my understanding is that all of the tested transactions were supported by copies of the memorandum of understanding that called for the refunds to be made. So there was documentation of the amount and the need for the refund and the entity. It just wasn't an original as opposed to a copy.
There wasn't even a copy.
Is that correct?
Some of the payments that we tested were, we were able to get a copy of the documents from the city attorney. But for some of them that we tested were not properly supported with the signed copy. So without the signed copy, we can't determine that if it's properly supported.
Okay, because this refers to original documentation, but even the unsigned document supported the refund and the amount, correct? To the entity, I mean,
Yeah, and I think the important thing is that we're not questioning the validity of the refund. It's just like Mark was talking about the documentation, having that documentation to support it for the completion of that transaction.
right, and I'm just trying to get an understanding of, is it that it has to be an original wet signature and not a copy? Since these days, many things we receive are by PDF, and it's difficult to determine what the original is, or is it that a signature was, what is the form of the documentation that your office wants to support these so that we know going forward?
I think original is best, but if not original and a copy, if we're looking at an unsigned document, we always have to assess the risk that could have potentially not been the original document, that could have been something created more recently. And so, we really are looking to see that original document with signatures of some form rather than an unsigned document, because we do want to make sure that transaction is valid and properly supported and not fictitious, so.
Yeah, and it's not us that's making this up. It's the records retention schedule that's the local government records committee that's comprised of a member representative of the Attorney General's office, the state auditor's office.
Sure, and we're familiar with the schedule, and I think we read the schedule in this respect differently than your office does. But just with respect to the statement that was made, I was trying to get clarity on the type of documentation that you believe that we should have.
When we created that schedule, and I was the chair of that committee when we worked on these schedules, it was records, original records. The records retention schedule is the fundamental basis is original records.
Correct, and the schedule allows for destruction after 6 years from completion of the project, and so that's, I think, where we read that.
Completion of projects.
Right, that's where we,
Could you give Mark the mic?
that's where we read the schedule differently in terms of whether or not that
What's
completion occurred.
Correct, that's correct. Yeah.
I would like to insert here that I was the one who actually came across the refunds that were happening from the city and, you know, the information that they were very old refunds. And when I started asking questions about it, I did get a response from the city, and I got what was basically looked like a boilerplate of what that, you know, MOU might have looked like. And they referenced an MOU, but as far as a specific MOU detailing that particular developer's name and all the specifics for each of those refunds, I was never presented with anything to that level of specificity, even in a copy form.
Point of order, Mayor, are we subject to Robert's Rules of Order in this meeting?
Typically, audit exit interviews have never been that formal, but I'm not sure if I'm having these folks lead as me, but
I'm just confused why, I mean, I'd like to hear the state auditor's findings, not some other person's who's not trained to audit, what their opinions are about which may or may not be true.
okay. Robert, you had a question or comment earlier? Okay.
I
Okay.
did just have one more question on the first bullet, which is, I just want to make sure that I understand the extent of issue here. So the concern was not all ACH payments, it was specifically the issue you're highlighting in your management letter comment is that, is about payments, specifically payments to the state for utility taxes. It's just that narrow category, is that correct?
Yes, these are for utility taxes to the Department to the state, yes.
So for some reason, the city's practice was that those particular payments were not going through the normal process of being reviewed by the auditing officer and city council. But you don't have a concern about other ACH payments, it was just those to the state for utility taxes, is that right?
Correct.
And
So during our audit, we reviewed these ACH payments that made to the states, and we gain understanding of the controls over that and processing it with the states. We noted that these were, so the payments for these were scheduled in the state's website before getting it to the city's auditing officer to review. Prior to schedule the payments, and we confirmed that these payments were never provided for council approval as well.
so someone at the city did that scheduling that you referred to, and whatever their process is around scheduling those payments didn't go through the review and approval process. Is that correct?
The review process was not done before making the payments.
Got
Is
it.
that- yeah.
Got it. All right. So it's just, and for each one of those, it was a billing from the state? Or who determined the amount that was being paid, the city or the state?
It is the city. It's based on a reports from the city's accounting system to plug into the state's website to calculate the amount that is due.
Got it. So our city process was calculating the amounts due, scheduling them for payment, and then the payment was occurring prior to it going through our normal review and approval process.
Correct. And we confirmed that these payments were reviewed by the finance director and the city administrator after they've been scheduled for payments in the website.
Yeah, but not prior to the payment going.
Correct.
And what about, and were they not listed on the city? So when we look at what city council actions we've taken to approve payments, were these ever listed on what we reviewed, or they were never listed on what we reviewed?
Based on our review, we determined that these were not listed in the packet for council review.
Thank you.
So you're saying the warrants that we receive, I know, every 2 weeks?
It wasn't paid by warrant. It was paid by this intergovernmental system.
Electronic fund transfers.
Okay, but you also said that it was approved prior to being sent, correct?
It's after.
Okay, I
So the
thought I heard earlier that you
process,
said
the process
before.
is that the person generate reports and plug it into the state's website to calculate the amount, and the individual, she would schedule the payments in the system, and then print out the tax return with the state, and then provide that supporting report, and then provide it to the finance director for the review. So that review process happened after the schedule being scheduled on the website, or schedule to pay the state. Does that make sense? Or
It does, although if it was, say it's scheduled for March 5th, but they get the report, so you're saying they print off the report after March 5th?
correct,
It's after the money was already sent?
correct.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Can you point us to the section of state law that you think the city didn't comply with here? There's just a general reference to 4224 here. And the reason for my question is the prepayment requirement that I see appears in 4224080, and that only applies to claims presented by people who furnish labor, materials, supplies to the city. And obviously, our payment of tax obligations to the state is not a payment to someone who furnished materials or supplies. It's just a tax obligation that we owe. So I'm wondering if that's the statute that you were relying on, maybe that's not a legal requirement that really applies here, or is there something else that you might have been pointing to?
Yeah, again, I'm not an attorney, but I'd have to look at 4224080 and talk to our attorney and see if your definition or understanding of 4224080 aligns with ours.
I mean, I'm just reading the
I've
terms
always,
that
in my
appear,
years
so-
with the auditor's office, I've taken 4222480 to mean payments made by the local government for goods, services rendered, or anything else that you're making payments for. So it makes sense that no payment should be made without the approval or authorization of whoever is in place that's been delegated to that authority to make that payment, whether it's the council or an auditing officer.
Right, so that sounds more like that's a business recommendation from the auditor, that no payment, as opposed to this is what the
Well,
statute says.
again, I'd have to look at the BAR's manual. The BAR's manual would refine that a little bit further than 4224080. So if 4224080 is refined by the BAR's manual, it's a good question to ask and refresh ourselves on. Does that exclude payments made to other governments, including state agencies or the federal government? I would argue that it doesn't. But again, it's a good question for me to take back. And
Well, I'm just asking because the recommendation says we didn't comply with state law, RCW 4224.
Yeah.
It doesn't refer to the BAR's manual or guidance. It refers to the chapter. So, and
Got
I
it.
have the statute here if anybody wants to read it. It doesn't include state tax obligations. It just includes, quote, claims by persons furnishing materials, rendering services, or performing labor, or any other contractual purpose, unquote.
Okay.
So,
point is taken, and I'll take it back for consideration.
If I could just say, I think the recommendation, I mean, I hope city staff agrees that no payment should go without our normal review process. So I really appreciate your bringing this to our attention, and I think clearly this is of a concern. I don't think, if I understand the city attorney's question correctly, I don't think he's questioning that. I think that he's saying this comment goes a little bit farther than just saying that, and it actually says that there's a violation of state law. And so I think my request would be, and maybe that's what city attorney just requested, in which case I'm being redundant, but if it's not specifically against state law, perhaps that could be revised out. but please don't take away the recommendation that this go through our normal review of process and bringing to our attention that it didn't.
Okay.
Any more questions relating to this section? Okay. So the next section in the management letter is relating to contracts and agreements. We have reviewed 2 lease agreements of the city's wastewater land. We review the agreement terms and payments that made to the city. Based on our review, we determined that the city have underbilled both tenants by a total of $12,707 in 2017 and 18. We also reviewed 2 service contracts, and we found 1 contract for coaching and consultation services where the city surpassed the threshold for having a contract in place, but the city did not have the contract for the service received. And because of these, we recommend the city to strengthen your internal controls and monitor the contract terms and agreement terms closely, and also ensuring that required contracts are in place for services received. Any questions? Okay, so the last section is cash receipting. We have reviewed internal controls over cash receipting and adjustment, and we found that the city did not have a citywide policy over cash receipting. We also noted some control weaknesses in the control process. For instance, we noted that the city had 39 employees with vault access, so we recommend the city restricting access to only those individuals that requiring it. We also noted that the city did not have a process to ensure a complete review is performed for all adjustment made in the system relating to utility billings. At last, we noted bid bond checks for capital project were held in the public work departments until project completion rather than depositing into the city's trust account. And based on our testing of some of the cash receipts, we noted a check was not deposited for more than a week. So therefore, we recommend the city to ensure all receipts are properly deposited into the city's account in a timely manner. Any questions?
I don't want to get into areas that we should take up with staff, but do we, to your knowledge, do we receive cash in more than one location? Because you then refer to a vault. You sort of imply we might be receiving it in more than one place, and then maybe we only receive it in one place. Do you know the answer?
Based on my understanding, there are multiple receiving locations in the city hall. In regards to the access to the vault, we noted that there are police officers that have access to the vault as well.
So, so there are different places potentially in this building, but there's no cash receiving, to your knowledge, happening anywhere except this building. Is that true?
There's also receiving location in the police departments
Okay.
as well.
Okay, so then, the vault, so I haven't been in the vault, so I don't know what it looks like, but if the cash was in I assume the cash is somehow out once it's in the vault, which evidently many people have access to, it's just sort of stacked there, someone could just go
No.
take some?
It's not a true vault. So there are locked cash boxes. The city does a daily deposit with the bank in the afternoon. There's enough cash, there's locked cash boxes with keys that are issued to individual, you're talking less than 5 employees, all finance department employees. They only have that access to it. It's secured at night. It's actually secured in a locking drawer in the locked key card access room that is called the vault. There's less than $500 in cash in those boxes at night. There is no loose cash at any time in that room.
You guys agree, or you don't disagree with that?
No.
And so so I'm trying to get at the question of whether the room is the problem or whether the cash box, guess I'm suggesting if there's a cash box that's locked, that only, sounds like maybe a few people have access to this key, but if it's just a few people, I'm trying to figure out why you still have a concern, is that it's too easy to remove the cash box and just walk away with it, or I'm just trying to understand the concern.
Clay, do you want to speak on that?
So just kind of limiting exposure into, like Robert mentioned, it's not a true vault, but limiting the exposure for where that cash is essentially stored.
Let me ask you differently. If they simply had a cash box, I'll use that term loosely, that was, I'm thinking safe, something that was of sufficient weight, or maybe it was attached, or so the box where the money wasn't easily removable, but they didn't close off the room, which sounds like it has a lot of activity in it. Would that satisfy, is your concern really just that the cash box could walk away, or I'm just trying to make sure I understand your concern?
Yep. I think the concern is the number of individuals that have access to the room, and if there was a loss, could the city affix responsibility? So we understand that the city's policy is to provide access to each police officer, which is amounting for most of the individuals that have access to the room. And we're just recommending that access be restricted to only those individuals that need to authorize the room, to limit the exposure if a cash box were to go missing or something, that you would be better able to affix responsibility.
Yeah, no, I understood that. I just can't figure out why you're making that recommendation. So, because it seems to me if the cash box was not movable, then it seems to me that you wouldn't have that recommendation unless there's something I'm not understanding. Your concern is the cash walking away is what I think I'm understanding. And so if is the only possible solution some room that a lot of people have access to, making it so they can't have access to it, or could the solution be just making sure the cash box can't walk away?
I think, if I understand it correctly, what we're trying to say is you limit the access to the cash. So whether it's in a safe that's bolted to the floor or in a room that's got a combination, but you limit the access to the cash. If you have 30, how many people? 39 employees with access to the cash, the room that contains the cash box that can be picked up and walked out, that's not exactly good controls.
Got it. That's what I thought you were saying. I just want to make sure that I was clear on that and you weren't saying something different. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'm not familiar with that. This is the first time I've heard about the details of that issue. I'm just curious from the police chief or who's in the back or the police department, are there procedural issues where, I mean, as part of that is a necessity of, there's 3 officers or 2 officers on duty at any given time of them coming to submit evidence or cash that was maybe
There's only,
secured in a, I mean, is that going to be problematic if you reduce it to 5 people and you got an officer's on duty, they've just confiscated cash from some sort of bust or arrest or issue, and now they have nowhere to put it because they have no access to the vault?
well, they would book that into evidence or found property and
Okay.
handle it that way.
So you have no concerns about this tightening up this control?
Well, not as far as holding somebody accountable. We have video camera throughout the building and exterior. So if somebody walks away with a safe, if you will, which isn't a secure area for officers only, and records, we would surely know who it is.
Yeah, you can see a badge number on whoever's walking away with the safe, right?
Well, there's not a whole lot of us. You'd know who it is. So,
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? So this is the management letter. At this point, I would like to pass to Clay to present you the financial statement audit report.
All right, so we'll go ahead and switch to the financial statement audit report. Should be that next report in your packet. And we'll go ahead and jump to page 4. And this is for our fiscal year 2018 financial statement. And this first report has to do with our report on internal controls, compliance, and other matters. So we perform our audits in accordance with governmental auditing standards, which requires us to report on any control deficiencies or compliance issues that we identify that are material to the financial statements. However, we do not give an opinion on controls or compliance, and we do not necessarily discuss the effectiveness of controls. So we will go ahead and flip to page 5, where we've highlighted a couple key paragraphs that discuss controls. And as you can see in that first paragraph that's highlighted, we did not identify any material weaknesses related to the financial statement process. However, we do have a management letter where we do discuss some control deficiencies, which we'll go over in a minute after we're done going through the financial statement report. And then the next paragraph has to do with compliance and other matters. And as you can see there, that we did not identify any instances of non-compliance or other matters that required us to disclose under governmental auditing standards. And now we'll go ahead and flip to page 7. So this is our opinion or independent report on the financial statements. This is where we give an opinion on the fair presentation of the financial statements as a whole. And the city does prepare its financial statements under the cash basis, which is a regulatory basis of accounting that is allowed under the BAR's manual in the state of Washington. And we'll go ahead and flip again to page 8. Lots of flipping in this report. And the first paragraph that we have highlighted there, this is our opinion on the financial statement. So a great place to point citizens to if they have any questions about how the last financial statement audit went. And as you can see here, that the city fairly presented in all material respects the cash and investments for the city and the changes in cash and investments. So that's your unmodified opinion or your good, clean audit opinion for your financial statements for fiscal year 2018. And then underneath that, one thing that auditing standards requires us is to give an opinion on the fair presentation of U.S. GAAP. And since the city does not report on U.S. GAAP, which is totally allowable, you report on the cash basis, we do have to give an adverse opinion, and that's just for reporting, the reporting side that auditing standards require us.
Can you
Are
just
there
clarify,
any-
Clay? Because
Yes.
I think there's still some information that keeps going around in the community about us getting an adverse opinion, that there are still, at least several hundred municipalities on cash basis in this state that you are giving the same opinion to. Is that correct?
Yeah, so this is the same opinion that every cash basis city has in the state of Washington. As Robert just mentioned, there's a number of cities, tons of cities that choose to report on the cash basis. There is not necessarily a threshold that you have to get to or reach to convert to GAAP. It's just a management decision at that point. So yeah, this is the same language that we'd see in other cities that are cash basis as well.
And more than just.
And more than just cities, yes.
This change, we used to not have what we call the dual opinion that you're looking at, the adverse opinion. You're probably familiar with the adverse opinion, and then the regulatory basis opinion. This changed as a result of a standards change in the industry for the United States. So it's about 5 years ago under auditing standards. We didn't have this up until then. So we audit in accordance with those standards, so we had to put this in there. So we had to say that you not only do you do your accounting on the regulatory basis, but you don't do your accounting on a GAAP basis, generally accepted accounting principles. But it goes into it. If anybody reads the adverse opinion, let me just read it for the public. The financial statements referred to above were not intended to, and in our opinion, they do not present fairly in accordance with those GAAP statements or standards. However, when you move it up to the unmodified opinion on a regulatory basis, the regulatory basis that the state of Washington provides to local governments, some relief from GAAP standards, it says, in our opinion, the financial statements referred to above present fairly in all material respects. So you guys are doing a good job in preparing those financial statements in accordance with the regulatory basis of accounting. So why is the adverse opinion in there? Because we have to put it in there per the standards that we audit to. The standards that changed 5 years ago under the clarity standards for the AACPA, American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, that promulgated these standards, says in the industry, in the United States, you're going to have dual opinions.
Yeah.
So you're going to see
For a
this.
standard that we don't use.
It's a standard that we audit too. So you're going to see that this, not only with this city, but other cities operating under the regulatory basis, other counties and school districts, and any other local government that uses the regulatory basis of accounting. So don't focus on the adverse opinion, focus on the unmodified opinion. If that one is modified, then raise your question.
Awesome. Thanks for that clarity, Mark. And we'll go ahead and keep flipping to page 9. This just talks about supplementary schedules, and we give an in relation to opinion on the fair presentation of your schedule of liabilities, and we noted no issues there. And then as we keep flipping to page 10, the actual report that's published on our website will include all of the city's financial statements, your notes, and your schedule of liability. So this report online will be inclusive and have all of that financial information. And then the last page is just information about how to contact our office. Is there any financial statement report questions or clarifications that you may have?
So I just want to make sure I'm just kind of summarizing this. So as I should have asked this back on the management letter, but back on the management letter, the one refunded twice item, $500 check that was refunded twice. Do you know, did the city identify that on its own and recover that $500, or was that identified by your audit?
It was identified during our audit by our office.
And do you know if the city has recovered that $500?
And we did not perform further review in those or follow up with the city in those items.
So am I correct in believing that as I look across the management letter, the only loss to the city that you identified is this $500 item?
Correct.
So would it be a reasonable summary for me to conclude we have a clean or unmodified audit opinion on the financial statements and on the supplemental schedule, clean and unmodified opinion there, and with respect to the management letter comments, the only loss that was identified was a $500 item. Is that correct?
It's the question relating to the management letter for accountability.
Which also the accountability report would be.
Do you mind just stating that again, Mark?
The $500 that you're referring to is in the management letter for accountability. The accountability audit report is a clean opinion as well.
Right. So the financial statement audit is a clean, unmodified opinion. The opinion on the supplemental schedule is a clean, unmodified opinion. The opinion on the accountability is a clean, unmodified opinion, no findings.
Correct.
And with respect to the management letter comments, there was only one item identified with a loss, and that amount was $500.
Correct.
Great, thank you.
And so now we'll go into the fund presentation management letter related to the financial statement audit. And this management letter is related to the presentation of managerial enterprise funds as well as a special revenue fund that did not meet the BAR's reporting requirements to be reported as separately stated funds on the financial statements. And once we communicated this issue to management proactively made the change and updated the financial statements to comply with the presentation requirements of the BAR's manual. Is there any questions related to the financial statement management letter?
Can you explain it again, what you just said?
Yes. So just the management letter relates to the presentation of funds on the financial statements. So there was managerial funds, which in this case was the bond redemption fund as well as a CIP fund for your utility operations. And those were separate accounts shown on the financial statements. However, the BAR's manual requires that the debt payments and debt servicing of enterprise funds as well as CIP related to those enterprise funds be rolled up and reflected into the actual utility that it is related to. So it's more of, there was no change to the actual numbers in the financial statements. It was a reclassification and kind of just rolling those funds up for presentation purposes. Did that kind of clarify on?
So it shows it was in 407 and 417, so what was it supposed to roll up to then? Which account?
Yep, so there was options. The city has 3 utility funds. They have I believe it's a water, sewer, and stormwater. And so the city had the opportunity to roll that into any of those funds, but based on the bond issuance, we understand that the bonds that were issued were for the entire utility system, or at least the water and sewer. I believe the city has chosen to correct the matter by creating a combined utility fund and rolling those funds into that.
Okay.
Yep. So just to clarify, the original financial statements showed a greater level of detail than was required by the BAR's manual. So in terms of the presentation, all of the total revenues, total expenditures, ending cash and investments, everything stayed the same. It was just how the items were split out, and we recognize that that provides greater transparency to a reader of the financials. However, we're just pointing this out because it is required to be summarized on the financial statements. You can still choose to show that level of detail in your underlying accounting records, your general ledger, but for these types of funds on the statements, they just have to be rolled together.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. Any other questions related to the financial statement management letter? All right. In that case, we will go back to the audit agenda where we first started, and Christina will close us out.
Okay, so we are now into our concluding remarks portion of our presentation. If you'd like to follow along, it is back on the exit conference agenda. That is the document on the left-hand side of your packet. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge the documents that were behind that last report, just so you're aware of the other items that are in your packet. You'll notice that we have a listing of what's called exit recommendations. Those are our small housekeeping type items that were communicated to management. Again, we typically discuss those specifically with management because we determine that those are typically the best place where they're addressed, but they are there for your reference. And then in addition, behind that, we do have the best practice document for small and attractive assets, so that you have that as well. So on the exit agenda, we've discussed the levels of reporting, which included the 4 management letter items and the listing of exit recommendations that are not included in the audit reports. We also wanted to bring to your attention that we do follow up on prior recommendations from our last accountability audit. In this case, we did follow up on the prior management letter over contracts and agreements. As we discussed, we did have some different recommendations in the area of contracts and agreements. So you'll see that that item is marked as partially resolved. We did not note the same issue that was noted in the prior audit, but as it is a similar heading and similar review, we are marking that partially resolved for the continued recommendations. Turning the page, you'll see that our audit is required to communicate certain matters by audit standards, and this does pertain to the financial statement audit. Under audit standards, we are required to let you know if there were any uncorrected, immaterial, or small misstatements that remain uncorrected at the end of our engagement. We're happy to report that there were none. So that means all items that were identified during the course of our financial statement were subsequently corrected, and that's really great to see. It's actually pretty uncommon. We typically still see items outstanding at the end of our audit, and so that is really great and a testament to your city staff's hard work. We're also required to let you know if there were any material items that were corrected during the course of the audit, and those would be large items. Again, we reported no significant issues or findings in the financial statement audit, so there were no material items that were identified. In terms of reporting or publishing the city's report on our website, we do expect those reports to be available in the next 1 to 2 weeks. As Mark said, we will follow up on the questions that were raised regarding the management letter and the accountability audit before we move forward with finalizing those reports and make sure that we're squared away on those items first. But once that is done, we will move forward with publishing the report. The management representation letter, we do request from the management certain representations during the course of our audit as to the information that was shared with us is true and factually correct, and we weren't withholding any information. That letter has been signed and provided to us from city management. I am not seeing that in your packet today, so I will make sure, it's in there? Okay.
The template is.
Okay, it's in your packet, that's why I'm not seeing it. So you do have a copy of the template that was provided, and we did receive the signed version back today, so that's available for your reference. In terms of audit cost, we did provide an estimate at the start of our engagement. There was a need to do a small increase during the course of our audit. That increase was communicated to management and subsequently approved. You'll see that listed there, and we are on track to finish within that updated estimate. For your next scheduled audit, as I mentioned early in my presentation, the city is typically an annual audit. So we do have scheduled for your next audit to occur later this year for the 2019 fiscal year, and that is scheduled to cover the same two areas, accountability and financial statements, and we have also provided an estimate for the cost of that engagement as well. We do like to remind our clients that if you expend over $750,000 in federal funds in any one year, that could trigger a third audit, which is a federal grant compliance audit. So it's important to be mindful if you're receiving a lot of grant funds if you exceed that threshold. And then lastly, on the last page, we'd like to also make sure that you're aware of some great resources that are available to you throughout the year. We have 2 support teams that are available to the city at no additional cost, and those are really great and are really being highly used out there amongst other cities and other local governments. The first is our local government support team. They primarily focus on updating the BARS manual, which we talked a little bit about during our presentation, but they also provide accounting guidance and reporting guidance, and they do travel around the state to do a number of trainings on these topics. If you have any questions on your accounting or reporting, we encourage you to reach out to them. We have a help desk as well as the trainings that they do provide statewide. They will be happy to assist you. And then the second area is the Center for Government Innovation. And as I mentioned, we did share one of the resources that they recently put out in your packet today. They are constantly looking for tools that they can create that can assist governments with improving the internal controls over the various operations that you do. They have a library of resources that is constantly being updated. We see new tools coming out each day, so that's great to kind of keep tabs on. But they also provide on-site training if you're interested on a number of topics, everything from lean to specific topics to even management. Again, they can come out to your site free of charge and work with your staff. So that's a great resource to use, as well as one-on-one assistance. So again, that's a growing area, and we really encourage you to check out the availability of those resources and whether they can assist the city in improving your operations. And then lastly, we will also be sending out a customer service survey once the reports are issued. We encourage you to forward that link on to anybody that participated in the audit process. All feedback is good feedback as we continue to work to better our services for the city. And should you have any questions, our contact information is listed at the bottom of the page. Yes, 2 questions.
I have a question. I know you are looking at the financial health of our city at the heart of your audit. I think that's correct. And I think you probably have a need to know or a desire to know about pending litigation or potential litigation. And you've asked some very specific questions, and I see the city attorney has provided what I think are comprehensive updates, including the current status of those things. I'm just concerned from your standpoint and from the city's standpoint, whether we get into privileged information, things that would affect the ultimate outcome with respect to how we ultimately resolve a case. So I'm concerned about you needing to know, but not being able to, being judicious about what you ask for and about how the city attorney responds to that. So may I hear from you and from the city attorney?
That's a very good question. As I mentioned earlier, that we audit under the same auditing standards that other governments and other CPA firms audit around the country. And one of the things we have to look for is contingent liabilities or liabilities that may exist that aren't on your financial statements. So we send out, as part of those required standards, we have to make inquiry into that, and management has to make representations to that, stating that they've disclosed to us all of those contingent liabilities, and they can evaluate or they can respond in accordance with, I believe it's the ABA's response to the auditing standard that we're auditing to the Association of ABA, I don't know.
The American Bar Association.
American Bar Association, thank you very much. They put together guidelines for attorneys to properly reply to those inquiries made by auditors in asking about those contingent liabilities that we have to then evaluate and work with management to determine if those liabilities have to go in your financial statements, whether disclosed in the face of the financial statements or in the notes of the financial statements or both places. So
Right, and with respect to this letter, in part because of the time lag between this audit and the audit period, which Councilmember Mayhew has already noted, probably the majority of the items described in the letter have been concluded already. They're required to be identified because they were open or active during the audit period, and so they're summarized there. And the remainder are all claims for which we believe there's no reasonable likelihood of an unfavorable outcome. And so it's really just a summary of the status of the matter, description of the matter, the status of the matter, that concluding statement, here's why we believe there's not a likelihood of an unfavorable outcome, and whether we're defending it in-house or outside counsel. So there isn't anything in this letter that caused me any concern or any need to resort to. We do have, I obviously can obtain outside legal assistance if we need, either from bond counsel or otherwise, if we need to finesse or address some of the nuanced portions of the ABI guidance, but didn't need to here for the reasons I was just summarizing.
Thank you both.
So can you talk a little bit about you said there were calls to the hotline, perhaps maybe the number of calls, and what was our total audit cost as a result of, or the cost of the calls?
Sorry, can we keep the audience
Yes,
comments?
Thank you.
This is not a time for audience comment. Can you plead your comments to yourself, or we'd have to ask you to leave?
Sure. So in terms of the number of hotline referrals that we received a total of 3 separate hotline referrals. In terms of the number of concerns embedded in each referral, they did differ between the referrals. Some were numerous, some were pretty contrite. But we were able to evaluate them. The really great news is that we were able to, again, through our planning procedure and our risk assessment process, we did not review all of them. We elected to either refer them to different divisions in our office that were better sourced to take a look at those, or they just simply were not selected. But for a number of them, we were able to pick them up and review them, and we were able to absorb that cost into the city's normal audit costs. So there was no additional charge for that. As I did mention, we did have a need to do a slight increase during the course of the audit, but that was not primarily driven by the hotlines. That was during the concluding phase of our audit and kind of working through some of these recommendations that we were gathering final documents and having final discussions with the city. Just to add a little bit about the absorption process, our accountability audit is structured so that we take a look at all the risks that we identified through planning and make a decision on which areas rise to the level of consideration or highest risk for inclusion. And so we were already looking at areas that touched on some of the citizen hotline areas, like disbursements was an area that we spent the majority of our time. That was an area that would have been selected regardless of the hotlines as we consider those significant systems and try to review those on a cycle. So this was the cycle that we were selecting disbursements for review, and all items that had a disbursement focus, we were able to absorb into that review. So.
Okay. Thank you. And I guess, as a result of the calls, you audited and you found no findings and minimal risk of possibly $500. So, thank you.
I just had one comment. I know in our discussions, you mentioned that I guess there was another meeting regarding other hotline complaints that have come to your attention that are going to be on the next accountability audit. Is that correct?
Yeah, we did receive, during our discussions with the citizen hotline, we did receive questions about subsequent matters that were outside of our audit period. Rather than increasing the cost to include those in our current audit, we thought it was best to table those for consideration for the next period for which the activity occurred. So those are up for consideration during the next audit. It'll be up to the next audit team to decide if that's rises to the level of inclusion for that audit.
Just a little bit. In some cases, we do vet these and kind of prioritize them. If there's any evidence or indication of misfeasance, malfeasance, or nonfeasance, we will, of course, not just defer and wait until the next audit. We'll come in there a little sooner with any indication like that. Okay.
Great. Councilor May.
Thank you for that comment. That's really comforting to hear. I think the comment I was going to make is just picking up a point I made earlier, which is especially having heard what you just said, that you're already aware of some concern, or at least a concern that's come in through the citizen hotline. Audits that happen 9 months, and I'm speaking in particular about the accountability audit, but I know you do that jointly with the financial statement audit. So audits that happen or begin 9 months later, potentially end even longer than that, I think it's a long time for those concerns to sort of sit there. I think certainly as part of the council, I would much rather if you were able to schedule your audits more sooner following the end of the period. And I think citizens would have a lot more comfort if they saw the results of your audit sooner than later. I think it would build confidence not only in your office and your audits, but build confidence with respect to the items being reported and whether those are or are not of concern. But I hear your comment is if you had a significant concern, it sounds like you would do something sooner than the scheduled audit. So that's comforting to hear. But if you could look at audit timing, starting 9 months later is sure is a long time before we get a chance to be aware of what you might find.
Appreciate your request. We will work with the team that's going to do the next audit, and we'll see if we can get this done sooner.
Thank you.
I just want to conclude by adding that I think you all are aware that we were, with the Snoqualmie Ridge community, one of the fastest growing communities in the state of Washington for over a decade. We went from 1,600 population to 14,000. And of course, along with that went sometimes kind of riding into a tornado of keeping up with that growth and growing our police department, fire department, building all new city facilities. And whereas I know you know that accounting and finance is the most exciting area of city governance for the general population, it's one area where the councils and mayors don't typically focus a lot of time as long as the ship seems to be going fine. But I mention that because I think a couple of years ago we became aware that, hey, this is an area where we haven't been putting maybe as much attention as we have or should have, given those growing pains. And the council's really put a great deal of effort, as well as the administration, is saying, we need to look at those controls. I say that just to say I appreciate that you working with us to, as this one paragraph says in the agenda, working together to improve government. So I'm very pleased to hear that you feel that your experience was that the staff worked very cooperatively with you and transparently with you to, again, to improve those systems and controls and help us raise that bar and move things forward. So thank you. Good to see you again, and appreciate all the work and due diligence you did. And I thank you, and congratulations to the staff too on a clean audit. Last item I just wanted to note was these finance accounting terms are fairly complex for the public in general. Findings, management letters, exit items, and so forth, or even clean audit. I want to clarify, because there's even when a word like fraud shows up, like in under accountability audit, it says, the purpose of doing this is to diminish the risk of fraud, loss, abuse, et cetera. To make it crystal clear, there's a profound difference between finding a weakness in a financial control or an error made in good faith and finding outright fraud or corruption. And to clarify what you mean by clean audit is, from what I understand, you haven't found any evidence whatsoever of any sort of fraud or corruption in any of the determinations you've made or any work that you did.
Yeah, that's correct. Again, these are clean opinions. We did not find any evidence of mismal or nonfeasance. And again, the recommendations we're making to you are not findings. They're recommendations to management to help in your development of better internal controls. As you mentioned, your city is growing, and I came down the Parkway, and I've been down there, it's the first time, and I'm amazed at how much business is there. It's incredible. So you're definitely feeling those growing pains. So yeah, we did not find any evidence of mismal or nonfeasance.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, if there's nothing further, then everyone have a good evening.
We're going to post it on the website.
It's not the full thing. I'd like the management letter and I'd like the whole working